Hello, and welcome to this Rain Taxi virtual event. I'm Eric Lorber. I'm the director of Rain Taxi. If you don't know about us, we are a nonprofit organization that champions aesthetically adventurous literature. Our work revolves around a quarterly magazine of critical writing. There's a copy behind me up there, and we have our summer issue coming out in just about a week. So if you want to know more about that, pop on over to our website sometime after tonight's event and poke around, see if you might want to get a copy or become a member and be with us for all sorts of good things. Another way we advocate for literature is through events like this. Tonight's event, like most of ours, is free to attend, but if you're able to pitch in a little something, please feel free to use the donate button at the bottom of your screen. We're privileged to receive funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Minnesota State Arts Board, among other funders. But our most vital supporters are individual readers just like you. There are other ways you can participate in the event tonight. There's the chat going on, of course. Keep all that good energy coming. And there is an ask a question box. So if you have a question for Curtis tonight, pop it in there, and we'll get to those a little later in the segment. And then finally, and most importantly, there's a button called Buy the Book. And if you hit that button tonight, you'll be taken right to the book page for the new paperback of Rodham. This is the hardcover because I read it when it came out last year. But we're super excited to have this paperback launch tonight and to have so many more readers be able to read this wonderful book. You'll be getting it from our partner bookseller, Majors and Quinn, here in Minneapolis. And if you don't want to stop there, keep poking around their website. Anything you buy tonight helps support them and us. Now it's my pleasure, my great pleasure, to introduce Curtis Sittenfeld. She has been a writer on our radar, on everyone's radar, ever since her astonishing debut, Prep. And in book after book, story after story, her prose has been one of the delights of this strange and getting stranger millennium. As I said earlier, her new book is Rodham. It's an astonishing, imaginative, alternate history, especially astonishing, maybe, given the events of the last few years. And we have absolutely the perfect person to talk with her about it. That's Betsy Hodges, who knows quite a lot about the political life, having been the mayor of Minneapolis. She is also an avid reader of fiction, so I feel we are double whammied there. I'm so eager to hear what they have to say, so I'll turn it over to them. Curtis Sittenfeld and Betsy Hodges, thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I am delighted to be here. I am Betsy. That's Curtis in the other window there. And indeed, we have known of Curtis for a long time. And I had the honor a few years ago now of getting a DM on Twitter from a mutual follow from Curtis herself saying, "Hey, I'm moving to Minneapolis. Would you be interested in having a cup of coffee?" And Curtis, I don't think you realized at the time that we had already met in a way in in a couple of different airports in the country. I was doing a lot of traveling as mayor. And in an airport bookstore, I had seen a copy of your book, Eligible, which is fantastic. It's a retelling, a recasting of Pride and Prejudice. And the second time I saw it, I was like, I thought about it between the first time I saw it in a rush at the airport and the second time. And I picked it up and I read it and I loved it, which is how I found your writing. So when I got your DM, you and I had actually already met through your work and through your writing. And I was just thrilled to get your message. We did have coffee. We've been friends ever since. And so the first thing I want to ask you tonight is, given that that was our introduction, was through one book where you were recasting a story, and Rodham is another book where you're recasting a story. It's an imagination about Hillary Clinton in a world where she decided not to marry Bill Clinton instead of a world where she did, and what happens leading up to that moment, and certainly what happens afterwards. And as a writer, what is it like to work within the confines of a story that is both known and new?
Well, first I have to say thank you so much, Betsy, for talking to me. I feel like there is like, no one I would rather be in discussion with about writing and politics and gender and the world than you. I think we'll have a very interesting conversation. So thank
Mhm.
you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Rain Taxi. Thank you, Majors and Quinn. So to answer the question, it's funny because I've been doing this like this thing for a while, meaning kind of like taking existing stories or narratives and sort of tweaking them or adjusting them or updating them. And I feel like only recently I had this insight about why I do it. I mean, I think there are probably multiple reasons, but one thing that I realized is um the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop when I went there 20 years ago was named Frank Conroy. And he used to say, that fiction is this sort of conversation between the reader and the writer. And I think that if I'm telling a story that you're already partly familiar with, I think it makes the conversation even more interesting. And because it's almost like, if you and I are talking about someone and you know that person and I don't know that person, it might be interesting, but it's really, if we both know the person, the conversation really kind of comes alive and we both have context. And so there is something sort of irresistible to me about, whether it's Pride and Prejudice or whether it's Hillary Clinton, um, kind of saying, I know you have some opinions and, maybe I'm going to address them or maybe I'm going to contradict them or maybe, like it just feels like so many opportunities for kind of richness between the reader and the writer.
And have you found that asking those questions and reframing it has helped expand your thinking and maybe readers' thinking about the issue? Is that part of the payoff of doing it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I see myself doing something primarily creative and entertaining as opposed to like teaching a specific lesson. So like, I mean, I think that Rodham is very much kind of, you know, a reflection of or an analysis of or like a distortion of the 2016 election. Like there's no mistake about that. Um, but I think it's also it's not kind of saying what an essay might say about the 2016 election, or like I'm not really making a coherent argument. I think I'm more holding up aspects of human behavior that are changed or not changed that sort of ask larger questions like why do we act the way we act, which is an endlessly mysterious question to me.
One of the things that I really felt as I was reading the book was just how much you understand that even if the circumstances are different, we're still who we are as people. That, and I don't mean just, Hillary Clinton is, who is she in this circumstance? I mean, all of us, like our behavior obtains under a variety of circumstances. And that really plays out in the book. Was that intentional on your part? Was that something you thought about while you were doing it?
I mean, something I do think of, um, I think that we collectively, like, I don't know if it's like as Americans or as human beings, I think we sort of act as if famous people or people in the public eye exist only when we're observing them. And so almost like we treat them as if they only have a public identity. And, everyone like brushes their teeth at night and, does all sorts of other things. And, people are even, President Biden is in the public eye for a very small fraction of each day. I mean, I suppose he's interacting with many more people than I'm interacting with, behind closed doors, but still. And so I do I think that I feel very interested in I feel very interested in the discrepancy between our private selves and our public selves, but I also feel interested in just almost like the existence of our private selves that I think we don't kind of like grant that to public figures often.
And I am a person who, in my own way, inside a city, have been subjected to that. I have been subjected to that dynamic. Like I've lived that, and that tension between who people see and who you are, that any gaps people will fill with their own stuff. It's very rarely filled with who you are.
Yeah.
And making that gap as small as possible is really challenging for anybody, but particularly for women executives. That gap gets filled with a whole bunch of cultural baggage that might or might not reflect our own experience of ourselves.
Did you feel, can I ask you this, when
Yeah.
you were mayor, did you feel that there was a sort of most frequent like misunderstanding of you?
Most frequent, there were a
Or
number
just like
of.
people filling in the gap, in a way that you felt like, like it sort of came up more than
Yeah.
once, or that was like, oh, that again.
I think people attributed a certain kind of ambition to me that I didn't have. But the confusion that was most painful was people thought I had no sense of humor,
Oh.
which I can see that in some ways because often when I was speaking publicly, it wasn't about funny or fun stuff, but also there was also public evidence that I did have a sense of humor, albeit sometimes very dry. And so that was just very painful because my sense of humor to me is one of the most important things about me. So that
I
was.
think you're very funny. I think you
Thank
definitely
you.
know, and like very irreverent too. Like I definitely was struck by how when we first met in person, by how and even I think even over text, like goes,
I know. And that's a hard thing to convey at a larger level. It takes, I don't know, I guess, and it's a harder thing to see and it's a harder thing to convey. But I loved this book for so many reasons. I loved reading Rodham. And one of them was you just clearly had a bead on what the personal experience was of women running for office, especially running for executive office. And that it's not a double standard. You do a great job of illustrating that it's not a double standard, it's a double bind. There's no right answer. There's no just right amount of smiling. We're either smiling too much or we're smiling too little. There's no just right amount of being partnered. You're either partnered well or partnered terribly. You know what I mean? Like there's no getting it right. There's no getting it just right. What kind of research did you have to do? Was it enough to just have been a woman in the world, or was there research that you had to do to really understand how those clamps tighten harder and harder the closer you get to executive office as opposed to legislative office?
I think the answer, no, it was not enough to have just been a woman in the world. I mean, I think that like I have, some public identity as a writer, but like, most people, there are very few like truly famous, right? And it's like, Stephen King or something like, and then you can count the others on one hand. So it's like, there's some, I think almost like, but mostly I did do like I read Hillary's two autobiographies, Living History, and then which was came out in the early 2000s, and What Happened, which came out in 2017. I read the memoirs of all the women senators who ran for president in 2020. So Warren, Harris, Klobuchar, Gillibrand, and I read sort of adjacent books like Jennifer Palmieri, and who was like the director of communications for Hillary, or Amy Chozick, who covered Hillary's 2016 campaign for the New York Times. And there's so much in those about like, especially particularly what you're talking about with women's voices, and that either if you, and I certainly included in this in the book, that if you sort of speak too loudly or assertively, you're seen as aggressive. And if you speak too quietly, you're sort of seen as meek or soft. And I think that Hillary has said to sort of speech coaches, well, can you give me an example of someone who does it well? And I think for a long time, no one ever gave an example, and that like there was no one that they could point to. And then I actually have heard recently that and perhaps not coincidentally, that Kamala Harris is considered to have like, she does that magical thing where, you know, enough of the population thinks, okay, she's speaking to me, and her screechy female voice does not irritate my ears.
Right. And people aren't used to women's voices in those conversations. And you point that out well in the book. It's just we're not used to hearing that voice in those settings.
Yeah.
And part of the reason I'm guessing that people can find Kamala Harris acceptable at that level now is because we did have the experience of not only Hillary Clinton running, but Amy Klobuchar in the debates, and all the women, and Elizabeth Warren in the debates. We're more attuned to having those voices in the room.
I think absolutely you're right.
Yeah, yeah. And um, at one point on page 305, 308, there's a campaign happening at the national level that Hillary is part of. And she says, well, it's almost like the subtext is becoming text. Almost, but not quite. Almost. Um, do you think that the subtext has become text at this point? Do you think that the machine's workings have been laid a little more bare?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, what we used to refer to as like dog whistles, like or almost like there used to be like double entendres, and now it's just like I don't know if a single entendre is a thing that exists, but yeah, I mean, it does feel like I think that you know, politics, you know, can often be, I mean, this is such a silly generalization to make, especially to you, but like it can often be ugly, or it's not like there was some pure heyday in the past. But even so, some of the events of the last few years, I still find shocking.
Yes, I do too. I thought that I had few illusions about how politics operated and about how whiteness operated,
Mhm.
as well as gender. But I was surprised,
Yeah.
right? Very surprised. And speaking of that, Donald Trump does make an appearance in this book.
Mhm.
And you, if I have this down correctly, you were writing this while he was president.
That's correct. That is correct.
What was it like to have to embody him in another setting where he's not president, but he's in the political realm? What was it like to have to embody that voice while it was running the country, while that voice was running the country?
I mean, it's a good question because so people often ask me, like, you know, if I've written a book that's sort of a, you know, a retelling of Laura Bush's life and a retelling of Hillary's life. And as a side note, I've never met either of them. So neither of these are very much novels. They're very much creative. It's not like I have access to, you know, secret sources in Washington D.C. But you know, so like people have said, would you write a novel from the perspective of Melania? And there's 100% no chance that I ever would. I wouldn't even write a short story partly because to do that is to sort of voluntarily spend my time imagining being married to Donald Trump. And I feel like he has taken up so much of my mental energy. And I mean, I'm about to undermine this, but there's a part of me that thinks I don't want to give him any more than I need to. That said, he does have a sort of, I would say maybe an extended cameo in the book. Like he appears more than once. It's not like page after page after page. And I think that what I was trying to do there was sort of, I'm sort of fascinated by almost like the sliding doors theory of life. And, you know, have all of us made small or large decisions that have drastically altered the trajectory of our lives? Or is there some path that maybe we've like gone a little in this direction or a little in that direction, but like, you know, like, is there somebody who in this life is like, you know, your spouse, and in some parallel universe is like your work best friend, but that person is still in your life? And so it was sort of interesting to me to think, okay, if you know, Donald Trump like were in Hillary's life, but in a different way, a very different way, what would that look like? And I did actually kind of clinically, if anything a novelist does is clinical, I did kind of clinically like study his tweets or, you know, watch his presidential announcement many times to kind of try to grasp his syntax. And it did feel a little like exposure therapy, where I almost thought, okay, I'm doing this voluntarily, instead of like looking at the New York Times page and like seeing that face and sort of feeling like, "Whoa," or like you're seeing some alarming headline. I'm doing this and I'm taking control of it. But it was artistic control. I never had any illusion of I was taking like political control, because all of his, policies, et cetera, were, whatever I wrote, they were still in place.
Yeah. Yeah. And that really came through. As I was reading it, both as an American and as your friend, you do a great job of embodying that voice and that person in this different setting. But I also thought, oh, poor Curtis had to spend that much time with him.
I mean, again, I felt at times like I was doing things as a writer that I wouldn't do as a person. So as a person, I would never watch, his presidential announcement in the Trump Tower multiple times. Or the sort of inverse of that is I would sometimes read articles written in the fall, like in the summer or fall of 2016, where the underlying assumption was clearly like, Hillary's not perfect. We're not crazy about her. Of course she's going to win. It's unthinkable that Trump would. And there's something like excruciating about reading those. But I felt like, I had to do it for the sake of the novel.
Yeah. Well, it's so good. And I don't say that just because we're friends. I say that because, hey, anybody out there who really wants a peek into what it's like to be a woman running for office, particularly running for executive office, read Rodham. But if
Oh,
you also just want a great story, a great thought experiment about life, life before and after a decision, when the road less traveled is now the road you've taken, also read Rodham. And if you just want insights about being a person and love, read Rodham. Just read it.
thank you, Betsy.
Just read it. It's so good. You're such a great writer, and I just loved reading it. And I will show the audience at home. This is my reading copy, and those are all the pages I dog-eared when I read it. Like, that's how much I mean, for anybody who's offended at people who dog-ear pages, just ignore that. But
I'm not offended. I'm honored. I feel this inner conflict where like I like to underline, and then I feel like, but it feels kind of blasphemous or something. And so now I've started using pencil. I've gone back to pencil after like 30 years.
I also use these page markers.
Oh.
I think I actually bought these at Majors and Quinn, by the way. So if you want page markers, go to Majors and Quinn. So first I should let the audience know I am wearing, the reason I'm wearing this shirt is it's a shirt that I did wear in City Hall. And I don't have many of those left when I was mayor. So I decided to wear it tonight. I'm essentially wearing a pantsuit in honor of this evening and in honor of women politicians everywhere. I am wearing a pantsuit, having worn them and loved them for many years. And what was it? In a second, we're going to get to the thing I teased online, which is on page 351, Curtis. So this is your heads up, because I'm going to ask Curtis to read a little part of the book that we worked on together. But there's a point at which you talk about the glass ceiling, or you have Hillary talk about the glass ceiling, but that she doesn't see it as a glass ceiling. She sees it as a grassy field, and she might be the first one to reach the other side of the field. That is a very spacious example in the way that a glass ceiling isn't. Do you remember that metaphor, and do you have a relationship to it? Is that how you think about it?
I wouldn't say I have a relationship to it. Like it's funny because there's a phenomenon in the age of social media. I mean, I remember like writing that, but there's a phenomenon where sometimes a sentence, I think this happens to many fiction writers, a sentence you've written will be sort of, isolated or put by itself. And then there'll be like sort of a beautiful like a background of like mountains or like a sunset over a lake. And sometimes it'll be like dialogue that I made this doesn't happen often, but it's maybe happened like in the course of my career, like 15 times or something. And so it'll be like a sentence, and then, there's like a lake in the background, and it's maybe a line of dialogue that one character said to another. And then it'll say like, dash, like Curtis Sittenfeld. And I'll think like, like what the people think in the book is not necessarily what I think.
Right.
And there can be, especially this sort of irresistible tendency, I think less so when there's like, it's Hillary Clinton's face on the cover, but for people to think the main character is a stand-in for the writer. So I mean, I feel I feel optimistic about like women being elected in the long term and progress and things like that. Um, I don't know. I mean, grass specifically, like I think I probably grabbed whatever was at hand.
Yeah. Well, it was great. It opened up some imagination for me that you had the character think about it that way as well. So that was super useful.
Thank you.
And because we are doing this event with Majors and Quinn in Minneapolis, which I recommend everybody go to and shop at online and in person, you can buy, if nothing else, you can buy page markers there, little brown page markers there, like the ones I bought there.
I think, is this like are you like a sort of spokesperson for those little those
I
little
love
page
them.
tabs?
I do love them. I do love them. I use them in my notebooks and all sorts of things. But it does, I think it matters. You wrote the book like it mattered that she was from the Midwest.
Oh,
Like it's in there. Like it matters that she was from the Midwest in terms of her values, in terms of her voice and her cadence. That she, that she spends so much time in Chicago and that she has such a relationship to Illinois. Um, do you think that there is, now that you live in Minnesota, you've lived in other places in the Midwest, you were raised other places in the Midwest, what do you think about the Midwest vis-a-vis the rest of the country and leaders? And do you think it matters that she had that Midwest sensibility?
I mean, it did matter to me, or I did see it as sort of influencing the fictional Hillary's identity, and I think, frankly, the real Hillary's identity too. Although that's like kind of a separate question. Um, but I've lived on the East Coast, for I don't know how many years total, like, but some time, and then pretty briefly on the West Coast. But I have spent a lot of my adulthood, and I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the Midwest, and I think there's something that's really kind of endlessly surprising and like silly but funny is that I think that often people who are on the coasts seem to have this like absurdly patronizing view toward the Midwest and think like nobody in the Midwest, kind of has a sense of humor, or especially has like a biting sense of humor or an edge. No one is grumpy. No one is liberal. Like it's like all this like
Right.
totally ridiculous, like, and so I feel like in general, my default, especially as I've gotten older, is I think to write from the point of view of Midwestern women and almost like to write the books I want to read, which is like grouchy Midwestern women with an edge. And I don't think Hillary is Midwestern, but I think that in some ways, if you're Midwestern, sometimes you're underestimated in a way that can serve you. Like being underestimated isn't always a bad thing, or like you're seen as nicer or more trustworthy than perhaps you actually are. And so I think that she sort of, in the novel, my fictional version of her, kind of, I think is aware of how she's perceived and how like sometimes, she's prepared to be like a workhorse, which again feels very like it sort of feels like maybe not having a sense of entitlement often feels Midwestern to me.
Right. And there's a scene in the book where I think someone's asking her to run
Mhm.
and says women have to be asked to run and men don't. So I'm
Oh
asking
yeah.
you to run. And I had to be asked to run, and now I ask women to run for just that reason.
It's so funny because that is a real phenomenon that like
Mhm.
men often, take it upon themselves to run and women have to be asked. And since reading that, I think I have suggested to a few women that they run, but none have ever taken me
Right.
up on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you're going to make one of two mistakes. You're going to either think you're ready when you're not, or you're going to think you're not ready when you are. And which of those mistakes you make is not gender neutral.
Mm.
right? So men think they're ready even if they're not, and they run. And then if they're running against other men who think they're ready and they're not, they win. A man who thinks he's ready, but he's not quite ready for the big leagues, he runs and wins. But women think we're not ready, so we don't, and then we don't win.
That's interesting. Another thing that I don't know if I knew this before writing this book, that there's essentially, and maybe there's been an explosion of this like since 2016, but I feel like there's like essentially boot camps. Like if there's anyone out there who's like a 35-year-old woman who thinks, I've wondered if I should run for office. If you're a Republican, don't. But if you're just kidding, if you're a Democrat, like you can, there are organizations that will support you and essentially train you to run.
Yes, there are. There are many of them. The Victoria Fund is, I don't think, one of them, but it's close.
It's fictional. Yeah, there's something called
yes, that's the one in the book for people who haven't read it yet, which I recommend you do because it's fabulous. And it's in paperback, so you can read it in paperback on the beach this summer.
Light.
Yes. Yes. Another thing I want to ask you before we get to the salacious moment that you and I talked about that's in the book. And it's me, and what I do for a living now, in a different way is what I was doing when I was in elected office and before, is I think about how to enroll white people in the work of racial equity. That's my work now. And white womanhood is addressed head on in this book. Because Hillary is a white woman, and at a certain point, she decides to take on, I mean, you can tell as much of it as you want, but she decides to take on trying to get the job that a woman of color wants. Let me put it that way. And she succeeds. And it's because, she thinks it's because, wow, this woman can't do this job, when we know in real life she could have. And over the course of the rest of the book, she comes to understand slowly the implications of having done that, because she does successfully edge this woman out of this job she wanted. And it is the foundation for her own future success. And at the time, she has an African-American woman who is her friend who calls her on it, and Hillary can't hear it. She can hear some of it, but she doesn't heed it, which is very much how whiteness operates in the world, and over time comes to understand it. Do you want to say a little bit, what made you decide to put that in the book and to handle it the way that you did? To me, it's really a representation of whiteness at work and white womanhood at work. It's not an assessment of race overall, but it is a dynamic that white women, we participate in all the time as part of how our whiteness shows up. Is there anything you want to say about that, or how did you come to include that?
I agree completely with your assessment. Like, I think it is, there's this, sort of multi-century failing of Black women by white women, and specifically like, white feminists failing Black feminists. And sort of also, like, I think white people making sort of individual specific decisions that never feel like racial or racist in the moment, as to themselves. And so I definitely wanted to grapple with that. I also, to sort of step back, I definitely voted for Hillary. I admire Hillary. I didn't want to sort of write like a Saint Hillary novel. Because that's not what novels are for. And I think that everyone, who has a career of any length of time makes mistakes, and like, some of us don't recognize them, some of us don't. But it's like, I've certainly, made mistakes. And so I wanted her. And I think that even, again, this is what plays out in the novel is not something that played out in real life, but it does. I don't think it's like presumptuous, which it's presumptuous to write a novel that's called Rodham, but I don't think it's presumptuous to say, it seems based on interviews that real Hillary has given, that it seems like there's some, phrases she's used or votes that, she's made that she might herself do differently today. And so I think it feels realistic that people change over time, people evolve. often, I mean, sometimes people become sort of more narrow-minded and less self-aware, and then sometimes people become more self-aware. And I think that happens. It can happen in both directions, certainly racially, but it feels like, I mean, obviously, race is a huge part of daily existence, and I think, as you sort of talked about, like, I think that some white people can pretend some of the time that that's not true, but it really is true for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a thread through the book that, given my current work, I just really noticed and appreciated, and appreciated that it was spelled out so clearly that that's what was going on without being preachy in any way. It was just how her life is going in the book. It's very, again, Rodham is a very good book, and everyone should buy it from Majors and Quinn and then read it and then give multiple copies to everyone, especially now that it's in paperback. Um, so there was a point at which you asked if you could call me up and ask me a question. Hey, Betsy, can we have a conversation? And you said, it's a delicate question. I understand if you don't want to answer this question. Do you want to say what the question was?
Sure. I mean, and I'm trying to remember, because I think, you have been single for some of your career and
Yeah.
married for some of your, and I think I said, almost, I think I probably said, like, not what did you exactly, but what might a single woman who, holds political office, who is recognizable, potentially, I mean, not definitely recognizable, but potentially recognizable, if she needs to acquire condoms, how would she do it? Or other, anything that's sort of personal or intimate products.
And just for the audience to know, I had no idea why she was asking this question, except I knew it was for a writing project. I did not know that she was writing about Hillary Clinton. I didn't, this was completely out of context for me. And I was like, wow, I don't know that I would. it, I said, well, you don't buy anything sensitive yourself at all. Um, but I did learn from another woman elected official who shall be unnamed that when you go, this was the answer, everybody, is what I'm giving you, is that when you go to the Pride Festival, all kinds of booths have jars, bowls of free condoms. And I had been an AIDS and HIV educator. This is something I'm very comfortable with. And so I was taught that if you needed them, you could go, you could just go to Pride. And then it's a natural place where you can sort of discreetly dip your hand in and put them in your pocket. I was taught this by another woman elected official who was also single at the time. So, you wanna read
Yeah.
how that
I
conversation
would be
plays
honest,
out
I
with
have to
the
say thank
research
you for
on?
sharing your expertise. And okay. Um, so I almost feel like I shouldn't. So not that I shouldn't read because of that part. Um,
Oh,
okay.
did you give something away?
No. Well, I'll say this takes place. It's in like 2005, I think. Okay, so I'm gonna.
You
The
can skip spoilers.
I'll skip some
Skip the
spoilers.
spoilers.
The night before I was to fly from Washington to San Francisco, the wisdom of procuring not only lubricant but also condoms occurred to me. Getting chlamydia from this man was not part of my plans. Another single female senator whose state included a famously liberal city had once told me that as casually, even festively as possible, she collected condoms at gay pride parades. Given, given that my dinner was imminent, this wasn't an option. I could have run into a drugstore myself, and there was a 98% chance I wouldn't be recognized. But that other 2%, especially after my cookie comments debacle, it would be humiliating if it became a gossip item in a newspaper. And then she sort of has her assistant, who's also, she refers to her assistant, has purchased like Pepto Bismol, and that's the kind of like nitty gritty where I was like, okay, if like I would sort of, when you talk about doing research, that is not in most political memoirs, like how do I acquire Pepto Bismol or condoms, but it's
Right,
like human
right.
beings are human beings.
Yes. Yes. I have to tell you that as a reader, when I read that, I was like, "Oh my god."
Well, I feel like, and I think that at some point, I think I did say like, this is for fiction, or is it okay if I
Yeah,
borrow?
yeah, yeah. Oh no, you told
I
me
don't
that.
want to be like, surprise. No.
And then when the book came out, you said, by the way, you're on page 351. And, that was the first thing I read, I have to be honest. Of course.
Understandably.
And this was even before I think I was living here in DC at the time. So that's very much a DC thing, apparently, is to pick up a book, find yourself in the index, and then put the book back on the shelf. So I did not do that. I have read the entire book, and it's excellent book.
It seems like you have.
And it's a very human book. It's not what really strikes me about the book is that it's not Saint Hillary, but it is in some ways. But there's just so much respect there.
I'm
There's just
glad you feel that way, because I think that there are people, especially who don't read the book but know the premise, who think like, oh my God, like have you no self-respect? Have you no respect for Hillary? And I do sincerely feel like, to kind of painstakingly over several years try to imagine what life is like from someone else's perspective, I feel like that is an act of respect. I will say that I think that my loyalty above all had to be to the book. Like, I couldn't write a novel where it gave off this smell that, like, what I hoped would happen was Hillary would write me a nice email or invite me to lunch. And it's like, she hasn't. I don't think she will. Like, it had to be like sort of grappling with the realities of life and the complexities of human nature. But I do respect her a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I also will say, just as sort of, I don't know, you might appreciate this as a person who's been in this world, that it's a funny thing about the publication of the book, which was a year ago, is that it gave me the opportunity. Like, sometimes people would say like, well, what do you think of Hillary Clinton? And I would say, I really admire her. I think a lot of people really admire her. Like, she's this sort of default way of talking about her is, people say like, oh, she's divisive or she's polarizing, but it's like lots of people really respect her work ethic, her preparedness, her compassion, her intelligence, her toughness, and like stamina. And like she's supposed to have a great sense of humor. And the funny thing is just the experience of being able to, like, sometimes for even more than 60 seconds, to like positively praise Hillary at an event that was not a fundraiser, like, felt really weird, and like something I had maybe almost never heard anyone else do. And it's like, I'm not alone. I think sometimes, again, like, because the majority of her admirers or fan base is or was female, it's sort of taken less, it's like fangirls or something, but it's like she's very inspiring to a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. Including me.
Yeah.
Including me.
Including me.
In a second, I'm going to turn it over to Eric in just a second for the Q&A, because we want to hear audience questions and get them to interact with you. I would like to say, on behalf of women, candidates, and elected officials everywhere, including myself, who have had it said about them, I'm not a sexist, but I want women in office, but I just don't like her. I don't know why, but there's something about her I don't like. For all of us, thank you for writing a book that describes that, and has a woman grapple with being on the other end of that, right?
Yeah.
We get portrayed a lot in the media about, well, they just don't like her, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's very rarely portrayed what it's like to be that person that
Oh my God. It's actually great to hear you say this, especially, again, because of your experience and expertise, because I feel like, so an editor at Esquire magazine commissioned a short story by me from Hillary's perspective, and this was back in early 2016, before the election. And I did have this experience where I thought, like I had thought, I don't have anything to say about Hillary that hasn't been said 90 million times. And then when I wrote it, I thought, oh my God, the question is no longer what do the American people think of Hillary? The question is, what does Hillary think of the American people? And then I had 400 pages of things to say. Yeah.
And you capture it really well for people who are curious about what it's like to be a smart woman, college educated at a Seven Sisters college, for that matter, but a college-educated woman running for executive office, in a world where people have the tools of sexism at their disposal and use them at will, and people don't really want to see that they're being used. Not that any of us are perfect, but if anybody's curious about what the personal experience of that is like, it's described very well in the book Rodham. But Rodham is more than that. It's not just, most of the book is actually not about that. It just, that's a place that I hadn't, for myself, I hadn't seen, and I really appreciate that exists. Most of the book is about how does human being live in a world where all this is going on. It's a book about being a human person through the lens of this one fictionalized character. It is not a book about politics that has this person as a pretext. It's a book about being a human being at its heart, which is really fantastic. So with that, it's been very fun to talk to you, and I want to turn it over to Eric so he can take over some of the Q&A from the audience.
Thank you so much. What an amazing conversation. This is so rich and thought-provoking. Thank you both so much. In my line of work, I'm constantly sawing that old saw of that fiction and poetry help us live our lives, help us understand our world. And your conversation today has demonstrated exactly why that is. So I think that's really, really inspiring. We do have a few questions coming from some different angles, and I think a lot of them are centering in on the fascination of what it's like to write about real people, Curtis. So one, though, that intrigues me is specifically about dialogue. And especially given what you said earlier about the kind of the behind the closed doors, syndrome that we all get sucked into. Did you have inspiration or challenges, and especially when doing the dialogue between Hillary and Bill?
Well, so I don't know if you haven't read the books. A decision I made is, the first third of it sort of. It's still very much fiction, but it kind of follows the historical timeline of Hillary and Bill meet at Yale Law School and fall in love. And in real life, he proposed twice and she said no. He proposed a third time, she said yes. And in my version, she says no a third time too. And that's when it sort of completely splits. But I suspect I'm not alone in, I can hear Bill Clinton's voice in my head without trying. I can hear his accent. I can hear the sort of cadences of it. But it was harder to hear Hillary's voice. And certainly I watched her a lot. But the big breakthrough I had was there was a podcast called With Her that was made by her campaign, I think in the summer and fall of 2016. And I didn't listen to it in real time. But it was the first few minutes of it it's interviews with her, people in the campaign, et cetera. But it was the first few minutes were sort of a revelation where I felt like, so often reporters were so skeptical toward her, and it was very obvious. And then she responded by being guarded, not surprisingly. And she was very unguarded seeming, and sort of, it just felt like this is her unfiltered voice, she knew it was for public consumption, but she also knew that it was friendly territory. And so I found that very, very useful to listen to. I'm going to grab a sip of water.
Yeah. Yeah, that's that makes a lot of sense. Part of the, I don't know, it feels weird to call it research, but I guess it's part of the.
Oh, it's definitely research. Yeah.
The research. Yeah. Now, I have a feeling you might reframe this one, but there's a sense in the part of the reader that there's this Hillary we already know, and then there's the imagined version, the fictionalized version. And what's that negotiation like as a writer? How are you dealing with like expanding upon or resisting expanding upon what we think we already know about this real person?
In some ways, I think that I kind of took some real moments, like, there was her famous cookie comment, or there was the famous, 60 Minutes interview in early 1992. And I kind of like reframed these external events. But I feel as if what I was doing, this is sort of a strange comparison, but it kind of, to me, it's kind of like Saturday Night Live and like a skit with Kate McKinnon playing Hillary. Like, that's not really Hillary. That's, Kate McKinnon in a wig. And you sort of, some things that she says might be, that Kate McKinnon says might be verbatim things that Hillary said in a debate. And then other things might be made up, but it's all in the interest of sort of making this skit effective. And I think, to me, it was all like sort of pushing the novel forward. Betsy, did you want to say something? Oh, I felt like I saw a little hand gesture. Anyway.
Cool. This one came from an email somebody sent me, but I found it really intriguing. I guess they had seen on a website somewhere, a reader responding. This is when the book first came out. That someone sort of going on and on about how, like, well, this book seems really interesting, but I don't know who Curtis Sittenfeld is, but I don't think it's right for a man to write about a woman like this, and went on and on with like paragraphs. And then somebody else responded, Curtis Sittenfeld is a woman. And like, that was like the whole exchange. But I found it curious, from the point of view of gender, like there's something there, right? What is something that you must have thought about?
In terms of my confusing name, or in
No,
terms of
no,
my right to write from Hillary's perspective?
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh.
Like, how does gender play into the fiction writer's right to write about what they want to write?
I mean, I think it's an interesting conversation that people are having about, where I think that most fiction writers that I know would agree that anyone can write from any perspective. But like, if it's not your perspective, you should be able to explain why you've chosen to inhabit, some other voice. And especially, it's like if you're a white person, writing from the perspective of a person of color, or probably if you're a man writing from the perspective of a woman. Again, no one would say don't do it. They would just say, have a reason for doing it and do it well. Like, don't make kind of amateurish mistakes. And again, I don't, like, if I were to look at all public figures, I don't think I would say like, I so identify with Hillary, but I identify with her in some ways. I don't completely not identify with her. And I think there are some, fairly universal aspects to, like, even the fact I'm 45 now, I'll turn 46 this summer. And I think there's probably ways that I see her differently than I did when I was 25 or 35, or sort of like looking at, it's actually interesting because I'm close to the age she was when she kind of came into the national public eye. Like, Bill had been governor. She'd had her own kind of prominence starting at her Wellesley graduation. But when he was running for office for president, and she was, a partner at the Rose Law Firm. And is it actually, Betsy, is it the Rose Law Firm or just Rose Law Firm?
That I don't know. I think it's the Rose Law Firm.
I think I checked, but I don't. Yeah, the book knows, but I don't know. Anyway,
folks know, Curtis is asking because I have family who are at the Rose Law Firm,
which I have walked by in Little Rock, but not been inside. But yeah, anyway, I was the age, so it was kind of interesting to think, like, oh my God, I think I was 44 writing certain scenes, and she was 44 when she sort of was under all this incredible national scrutiny in the early 90s.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting because age and generations, and that all comes into it too, with anybody's history. For this last one, Betsy, you should chime in on this too. So where, given all the challenges that are a part of civic life now, political life, now meaning we are more aware of them now, but given all these challenges, what what place does fiction have in that? What connections can we make to build that better world we're all after?
Curtis, do you want to go or do you want me to go with
You
that?
go, you go.
I'll speak from the standpoint of a reader. I'm a writer mostly of
I know.
nonfiction.
Speak from the. Where does nonfiction have to offer?
Yeah, yeah. I To your point, Eric, about fiction and poetry, one of the blessings of them, and I continue to read poetry every day, and I am a avid fiction reader, because they give us an imagination for our bigger selves. I think the best of it does for me is I look for an imagination for our bigger and best self and how that can play out in the world, um, as well as it can finally hone the worst of us as a way of recognizing it.
Mhm.
It's not a place I choose to live very much. It's very public. I'm a recovering alcoholic. And so if I spend too much time contemplating the worst of people, I am walking toward a bottle, not away from a bottle. So I like to think about the best in people and what brings it out. Um, and there's something about the voice of fiction included, and this book did this for me, as I've said already, and poetry that echoes inside me in a way that my own voice does not, or my day-to-day reality does not. Writing nonfiction can help elicit my best thinking and my best ideas as a writer. And as a reader, it can illuminate, the best of it just illuminates an understanding of something that I did not understand before. And that is as true for fiction and poetry as it is for nonfiction.
I love that answer so much that I want to ask a follow-up question. And who I feel like I'll let that one stand. Do you read like when you read poetry every day? Do you read like an individual poem, or do you read like a book by a certain poet, or do you have a sort of default?
In the morning, I have a variety of ways to get poems of the day, and I read one or more of those. Um, and then in the evening, I'm working through a volume of poetry by a poet that I like, and I'll read one or two poems every night at the end of the day as part of my going to bed ritual. And then when I was mayor, I incorporated poetry in all my big public events, particularly my State of the City event and my inauguration. There was poetry reading by poets from Minneapolis. Camille Gage put that all together, and fantastic poets came together. And then whenever I gave a State of the City address, we would have poetry readings, poetry read at the beginning that had some connection to Minneapolis and to the speech, and then other events as well. I would incorporate poetry very, very consciously. And we were working on a poet laureate when I left office.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah.
It is great. Well, thank you both again for this extraordinary conversation. To our viewers out there, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget that you can snag a copy of Rodham, a signed paperback, signed today by Curtis. I was with her when she did them, and it was a joy to see in person. So jump online, or if you're in Minneapolis, go to the store, buy Rodham, read Rodham, and come back and join us for another event. Rain Taxi will have 2 great poetry events in June, and we will shortly be announcing 2 great fiction events for July. So we're going to keep up with you this summer. Thanks so much again to you both and to you all. Good night.
Thank you.